Hi, in this video lecture I'm going to discuss logic, reasoning, and argumentation. We know from Aristotle that logos is a key aspect of effective persuasion, so we're going to focus specifically on logos and how we can be more persuasive through logical appeals. Here's a quick preview of where we're going. First, we'll look at how to develop a good argument, with an emphasis on the Toulmin model of argumentation and different types of reasoning. Then we'll discuss a variety of logical fallacies. These are breakdowns in reasoning that make arguments invalid. Finally, we'll explore an alternative paradigm called narrative rationality that can help us understand why arguments that aren't purely logical and rational are still very effective. Okay, let's get started. We begin by looking at how to develop a good argument and use valid reasoning, and most of this material comes from reading number 4, so make sure you review this article for more details. Reading number 4 focuses on a model of argumentation developed by a British philosopher named Stephen Toulmin. It's a basic blueprint for a good argument. The Toulmin model has 6 parts, 3 primary components and 3 secondary components. The model begins with a claim, which is basically the position you're taking in your argument. This claim should be supported by evidence, or what Toulmin calls grounds. Think of this as the ground or the foundation of your argument. The grounds are the relatively objective facts that should not be in question. Of course, what we should do or think in response to these facts is a matter of persuasion. That's what your claim is all about. And the claim and the grounds need to be connected through valid reasoning. The connection needs to be justified, what Toulmin calls a warrant. Now, sometimes this term warrant is a little tricky, but think about how this term is used in a way that you're probably familiar with. We know that the police, for example, need to have a warrant to search your house or apartment. They have to have a valid reason for coming into your place. Their search has to be justified or warranted. That's just what we're talking about here. For your argument to be effective, to be persuasive, there has to be a good reason to make your claim based on the grounds you provide. Your claim has to be warranted based on the evidence. So these are the 3 primary components of a valid argument. But to make your argument even stronger, Toulmin says we need to add 3 additional things. First, we can make our warrant even better by adding backing. This is anything you do to enhance the reliability of the warrant. Stuff you add to further justify the connection between the grounds and your claim. Basically just more development of your warrant. Next, you also want to qualify your argument, which means you modify your claim or make it more focused. After all, few arguments apply to all people in all situations under all circumstances. So indicate the boundaries of your claim, the limits of your overall argument. For example, often when couples argue, someone says something like this: "You always say this," or "You never do that." But of course, these arguments are easy to refute because people can usually come up with at least one example where they didn't do or say what they were accused of. So instead, a more effective argument would qualify the specific conditions under which the claim is valid. In the case of our arguing couple, it would be much better if someone said, "I don't like when you do this specific activity under these conditions in these circumstances." That sort of claim cannot be easily refuted. It needs to be taken seriously and thus will be probably more persuasive. Now, in practice, your claim and your qualifier will often be combined into one integrated statement. But for the model, we separate these components just to make sure everything is clear. And because sometimes your claim and your qualifier will be separate, depending upon how you want to convey your overall argument. Finally, we need to include a rebuttal, which means you want to acknowledge counter-arguments to your position. Now, at first, this may seem counterintuitive. After all, doesn't it take away from the persuasiveness of your argument if you acknowledge the other side? Well, not necessarily. In fact, it will probably make your argument more persuasive. After all, in the realm of persuasion, there will always be other sides to your argument. If there weren't, we wouldn't need persuasion in the first place. So pretending there's not a legitimate alternative to your position actually makes you look a bit naive and uninformed. Instead, you should articulate the basic position of the other side and then explain why your position is still preferred. This will actually enhance your credibility because it demonstrates that you've come to your position in full knowledge of other competing alternatives. So that's the basic structure of a Toulmin model, a blueprint for an effective argument. Let's take a look at a specific example. The cost of tuition is certainly an issue for most students, or at least your parents. It's something a lot of people care about. And every few years, the university talks about tuition prices, and a variety of arguments are made about whether or not we should raise tuition. So one potential claim might be that the University of Colorado should increase tuition by 5%. Evidence for this claim could be that CU is facing a budget shortfall and needs to increase revenue. This evidence or grounds is just factual information about the current situation. Regardless of your position, it's just a fact that the university needs to raise more money to address its budget shortfall if it cannot cut costs any further. But nothing in this evidence suggests we need to raise tuition. After all, there are a number of things the university could do to raise more money besides increasing tuition. So, how do we get from these grounds to our specific claim about raising tuition 5%? That's where the warrant comes in. We need to justify the connection between the grounds and the claim. We need to provide a good reason why our specific claim is the best option in light of this evidence. One reason might be that tuition increases are the fastest way to raise the most money. And we could enhance this warrant with some additional backing, like saying that such a large percentage of CU's budget comes from tuition, and tuition increases are effective immediately. But of course, we also need to qualify our claim and make it more focused. We should note that tuition increases do require approval from the university's Board of Regents, so this could turn the tuition increase into a political issue since the Board of Regents are elected. So there are some limits to our claim. We should also acknowledge a counter-argument to our position, like the idea that tuition increases may actually decrease enrollments and thus lower overall revenue. And we would want to address this counter-argument with some sort of rebuttal to this rebuttal in order to sustain and even enhance our credibility. So that's our argument according to the Toulmin model of argumentation. At the most basic level, we have a claim that is warranted based on the evidence. Here's another way to think about it. Based on this evidence, the grounds, you should think or do this, your position, because of this reason. The connection between the claim and evidence is warranted. Now, when we break down an argument like this, it seems a little abstract and detached, kind of dry and boring. Logically correct, but not necessarily very compelling or persuasive. But don't worry, we still have a lot to say in our future classes about adding style to your argument and making it more attractive and exciting. The Toulmin model is just the blueprint. We still have a lot of interior decorating to do to make this place aesthetically pleasing. But it doesn't matter how beautiful you decorate the house if the foundation isn't sound. So the first step in developing a good, persuasive argument is to lay a solid foundation. And the Toulmin model helps us do that. And of course, no argument is perfect. If you nitpicked our previous example, I'm sure you'd find a few things to question. But that doesn't make arguments ineffective or unpersuasive. Arguments shouldn't necessarily be evaluated as right or wrong. Otherwise, there would be no need for argument in the first place. There's no argument about whether 2 + 2 = 4. We don't need persuasion for this. Instead, arguments should be evaluated as valid or invalid. A valid argument means that there is a good connection between the claim and the grounds and the warrant, whereas an invalid argument has a breakdown somewhere in this process. An invalid argument isn't necessarily wrong. Your position might be correct. It just means you haven't demonstrated a good connection between your position, the evidence, and your reasoning. And the reasoning is often where people get tripped up. The facts are the facts, and claims are relatively straightforward, but how these are connected is often a source of confusion. So, now that we've covered the basic blueprint of a good argument, let's move on and look at reasoning more specifically, that warrant component of the Toulmin model. Reading number 4 covers 3 main types of reasoning we need to know about: deductive, inductive, and analogical reasoning, and we'll say something about each one of these. First, deductive reasoning is when we start with general observations in order to make specific conclusions. So a deductive argument might take statistical data about all University of Colorado students, for example, in order to make conclusions about one specific class, like the fact that over 40% of all CU students are from out of state, so in our specific class, we can expect that nearly half the students are, well, from out of state. Now, inductive reasoning just reverses this. We start from specific observations in order to make general conclusions. So we might make observations about a specific class at CU in order to develop general conclusions about all CU students. And of course, the ideas of general and specific are relative. What might be a general observation in one situation could be a more specific observation in another. Like in the example we just mentioned, one class would be a more specific instance if we were trying to generalize to all CU students. But we could also take one class as a general observation to make a specific conclusion about 1 to 2 students in that class. What matters is just whether you're moving from big to small, deductive, or from small to big, inductive. So if we return to our Toulmin model, a deductive argument, moving from big to little, would involve making a specific or narrow claim based on grounds or evidence that were very broad, like claiming we should institute a new policy on our specific campus based on what is happening at universities across the nation. On the other hand, an inductive argument, moving from little to big, would involve making a general or broad claim based on evidence or grounds that were more narrow and specific. Like if we started with the evidence of a specific crime on one part of our campus in order to make a broad claim about a new sweeping policy that should be instituted across the entire campus. Notice that both arguments involve instituting a new policy on campus, but one moves deductively based on national data, the other moves inductively based on a specific incident. The starting point is relative. What matters is if you're moving from big to small or small to big. And your argument will be evaluated on whether or not your reasoning to connect the claim and evidence is sound. Making too big a leap from the specific to the general, or from the general to the specific, means people might see your argument as invalid. Finally, analogical reasoning is when we offer a warrant, the connection between claim and grounds, that is based on analogy, comparison, or similarity. Like saying a certain purchase is a waste because it's like throwing money down the toilet. We're borrowing meaning from one familiar context and applying it to the newer context of our claim. The connection isn't direct or identical. If it was, we wouldn't need the argument. But it is familiar enough that people will see your argument as valid. For example, check out this ad for DirecTV. It uses analogical reasoning to make an argument in favor of DirecTV instead of cable.
Sick of this thing popping up.
I know. Cable's more annoying than...
I shouldn't have to stop watching a show or cancel a recording. Cable's worse than...
Totally. You need to upgrade to DirecTV and get the new Genie. She lets you record 5 shows at once.
Wow. DirecTV is better than...
Record 5 shows at once with the new DirecTV Genie. Call 1-800-DirecTV.
Now, of course, cable and DirecTV aren't literally like this, but if you identify with these comparisons, this analogical reasoning, you might find this argument persuasive. And in fact, the validity of this kind of argument is based on whether or not people accept or buy into the analogical connection you make between your claim and the evidence. Okay, so that's our initial overview of argumentation and reasoning based on the material in reading number 4. We now have a good foundation for developing valid arguments, with a particular emphasis on creating a sound warrant to connect our claim with the grounds through good reasoning. But obviously good arguments are hard to develop, and many people make claims in society that aren't very good. They don't make good arguments. So what happens when reasoning breaks down? We call this a logical fallacy. Fallacy just means mistake or error. So we're talking about errors in the logic of an argument or the reasoning of an argument. Basically, the warrant used to connect the claim and the grounds is faulty. It's not logical that the position offered could or should be connected to the evidence based on the reasoning provided. It doesn't mean that the claim is wrong necessarily, but it does mean that the reasoning used to justify the claim is faulty. And reasoning breaks down for any number of reasons. But there are some common patterns that philosophers and scholars have identified over the years. I've got a list of some of the main logical fallacies here, though many books and websites certainly have more. These are just some of the main ones, and if you're aware of these, you'll be in position to develop better arguments and identify bad arguments. So we're going to look at an example of each one of these in order to understand how reasoning breaks down so we can avoid these kinds of breakdowns when we develop our arguments and identify breakdowns in reasoning in other people's arguments. First is the post hoc or false cause fallacy, and you'll notice that a lot of these logical fallacies have Latin names. This fallacy involves claiming that something is true simply because it comes after something else, like saying that umbrellas cause rain because every time I see people bringing umbrellas to work, it rains later that day. The point is, something does not necessarily cause something else just because it precedes it. Take a look at this example from the TV show Seinfeld. And I readily confess that as someone who came of age in the 1990s, I understand most social phenomena through the lens of Seinfeld, as you'll come to see in many other examples throughout the semester. In this situation, the Elaine character is upset because the new guy she is dating happens to have the same name as a serial killer that is terrorizing New York City. The Kramer character then comes in and makes an argument about what causes serial killing, based on the fact that some famous serial killers, like Son of Sam, were adopted. Take a look.
The whole city is talking about this monster, Joel Rifkin, and I am dating a Joel Rifkin.
But you like your Joel Rifkin.
Yeah. I just wish he had a different name.
Ask him to change it.
Oh, you can't ask a person to change their name.
Why not?
What, would you change yours?
If someone asked me nicely. I'm Claude Seinfeld.
Hey, how many people did Rifkin strangle? 18?
Yeah, 18 strangles.
Yeah, well, you know why Rifkin was a serial killer? Because he was adopted.
You know, just like Son of Sam was adopted.
So apparently, adoption leads to serial killing.
Okay, see how Kramer's argument was based on a false cause? We know that adoption doesn't cause serial killing. It merely precedes it as a matter of circumstance. So the false cause fallacy is faulty reasoning because it tries to make a causal connection where there is only circumstantial evidence that happened to precede the event in question. Next we have the ad hominem or personal attack fallacy. This involves making an argument based on someone's supposed character flaws that are really unrelated to the substance of the argument. Take a look at this example from a cable news pundit giving an editorial or on-air comment. A few years ago, Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts passed away, and a special election was held to fill his vacant seat. One of the candidates was a Republican named Scott Brown. Clearly, this political pundit doesn't want people to vote for Scott Brown. But see how his argument is based mainly on a personal attack.
After 9/11. In short, in Scott Brown, we have an irresponsible, homophobic, racist, reactionary, ex-new model, teabagging supporter of violence against women and against politicians with whom he disagrees. In any other time in our history, this man would have been laughed off the stage as an unqualified and a disaster in the making by the most conservative of conservatives. Instead, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is close to sending this bad joke to the Senate of the United States.
Okay, a bit subtle, but I hope you caught the personal attack. Now, Scott Brown may or may not be a good candidate to fill Senator Kennedy's seat, but whether or not he is should be based on the substance of his policies and his intentions as a politician. He did win the election, by the way. So this isn't much of an argument. There's no valid reasoning here. It's just a personal attack. Next up, we have the ad populum, or bandwagon fallacy. This involves making an argument by simply appealing to popularity. Here's an example from the 2008 presidential election, specifically the competition in the Republican primary. One of the potential Republican candidates was former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee. Check out this TV ad for the Huckabee campaign and see if you can spot the bandwagon fallacy.
An important policy message from Governor Mike Huckabee.
My plan to secure the border? 2 words. Chuck Norris.
Mike Huckabee's a lifelong hunter who'll protect our Second Amendment rights.
There's no chin behind Chuck Norris's beard, only another fist.
Mike Huckabee wants to put the IRS out of business.
When Chuck Norris does a push-up, he isn't lifting himself up. He's pushing the earth down.
Mike's a principled, authentic conservative.
Chuck Norris doesn't endorse. He tells America how it's going to be. I'm Mike Huckabee, and I approve this message. So did Chuck.
Chuck Norris approved.
Well, and at the time, Chuck Norris had a newfound popularity, so this is definitely a clever ad for sure. But not much of an argument, just an appeal to popularity. Another common fallacy is the either-or fallacy, which involves reducing complex issues into simple either-or choices. Sometimes people call this the false dichotomy or false choice fallacy because the argument forces you to choose between 2 undesirable options. Here's an ad for a cable news program that demonstrates this faulty reasoning.
The beginning of change or the end of capitalism. Bringing them home or giving up the fight. Path to freedom or gateway for terrorism. You decide. As America faces tough questions, only one network delivers fair, balanced, and accurate reporting, so you can make a choice. Fox News Channel. We report, you decide.
Notice how all these important things, the economy, military intervention, immigration, are reduced to simple either-or choices that don't account for the complexity of the issues. This is the kind of faulty reasoning that will make your argument invalid and ineffective. Next up, we have the straw man fallacy, named for arguments that are aimed at defeating a fake version of the other side's position. If you are arguing against something, you need to make sure you represent the other side fairly and accurately. It's easy to defeat a caricature or weak version of your opponent's position, a straw man. Watch in this example how President Obama represents the opposition's position on the economy and government, and the cable news pundits who discuss this straw man fallacy.
In fact, this larger notion that the only thing we can do to restore prosperity is just dismantle government, refund everybody's money, and let everyone write their own rules and tell everyone they're on their own, that's not who we are. It's not the story of America.
That was President Obama on Thursday night, urging Congress to give government one more chance to save the ailing economy. Included in his $450 billion American Jobs Act are more temporary tax cuts to spur hiring, spending to rebuild infrastructure, and extended assistance to the unemployed. So will it work, and can it pass a Republican House? Joining the panel this week, Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, editorial board member Jason Riley, and columnist Mary Anastasia O'Grady. Dan, just quickly at the top, that quote from the president. You know anybody who thinks that?
I think I talked to a guy in a bar stool once who characterized the opposition that way.
I don't even think Ron Paul believes that. You know, the sort of lighthouse libertarians.
Yeah.
But, anyway.
But that was one of the. But that was, you know, that was. He tried to give this serious speech, but he couldn't help himself, and he has to. You listen to something like that, and you say, is this just in there for political effect, or does he really believe it? And I think the answer is both of those things. He really believes that the opposition's position is to basically dismantle everything, go back to survival of the fittest, tooth and claw, and let everyone fend for themselves. And he's the guy standing in the preventing that.
Not a good way to get bipartisan cooperation. But
okay, so the point is that President Obama is arguing against a political position that few, if any, of his political opponents actually hold. So it's easy to defeat the straw man, but it's not much of an argument. The test is if the other side hears your representation of their position, they should say, yeah, that's pretty much my position on the issue. You got it right. Otherwise, you're just arguing against a straw man, a cheap caricature designed to make your argument look good, but in actuality, not valid reasoning. Circular reasoning is our next logical fallacy. Circular reasoning happens when your conclusion is the same as the premise of your argument. Like when I tell my kids to go to bed, and they say they don't want to, and I say, why not? And they say, because we don't want to go to sleep. And I say, that's not a reason. You're just restating your conclusion as the premise of your argument. And they say, why do we have to have a dad that's a professor who teaches logic and reasoning? I think a good visual representation of circular reasoning is these Escher drawings you may have seen. Notice how in these images there's no real difference between the beginning and ending, the premise and the conclusion of the pictures. And here's an example of circular reasoning from a political cartoon that was published in a magazine during the Iraq War. During that time there were very strong opinions about whether we should send more troops to continue the fight. In this image, the political cartoonist is accusing the Bush administration of using circular reasoning to justify or warrant the claim that we should send more troops to Iraq. A vivid example, to be sure, but see how the cartoonist is trying to point out that Bush's argument is circular. It's claiming that there's a breakdown in reasoning because there isn't a valid connection between the claim and the evidence. The evidence becomes the claim, which becomes further evidence, which supports the claim, and on and on and on we go. One big circle, but no valid argument. Next we have the genetic fallacy, which is making an argument that a position is wrong simply because of where it came from. Its genesis, but not the merits of the idea. Take a look at this example, which comes from the realm of religious argument. Here we see the famous biologist and atheist Richard Dawkins responding to a question at a public presentation, saying that religious belief isn't valid because of where it came from, namely family and culture. And then we transition to a philosopher who criticizes Dawkins' argument, explaining how he commits the genetic fallacy.
This is probably going to be the most simplest one for you to answer, but what if you're wrong?
Well, what if I'm wrong? I mean, anybody could be wrong. We could all be wrong about the flying spaghetti monster and the pink unicorn and the flying teapot. You happen to have been brought up, I would presume, in the Christian faith. You know what it's like not to believe in a particular faith because you're not a Muslim, you're not a Hindu. Why aren't you a Hindu? Because you happen to have been brought up in America, not in India. If you'd been brought up in India, you'd be a Hindu. If you were brought up in Denmark in the time of the Vikings, you'd be believing in Wotan and Thor. If you were brought up in classical Greece, you'd be believing in Zeus. If you were brought up in Central Africa, you'd be believing in the great Juju up the mountain. There's no particular reason to pick on the Judeo-Christian God in which, by the sheerest accident, you happen to have been brought up.
Suppose somebody was born in Saudi Arabia. They would be a Muslim by nature of where they were born.
Yes, that's very true, but to think that that somehow invalidates a person's Christian belief is a textbook example of a logical fallacy called the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is trying to invalidate a position by showing how a person came to hold it. And that's obviously an invalid way of reasoning. A person might come to hold a belief for any number of reasons, some of them inadequate, but that doesn't show that the belief itself is false. So, for example, if you had been born in ancient Greece, you probably would have believed that the earth is flat and perhaps that the sun goes around the earth. But does that mean that your belief that the earth is round and that it goes around the sun is therefore unjustified or false? Well, obviously not. You cannot invalidate a belief simply by showing how a person came to hold it. That is to commit the genetic fallacy.
Now, regardless of what you think about religious belief, the point is, in general, you can't invalidate a position simply by showing how someone came to hold that position. You have to address the actual merits of the position. Moving on to the red herring fallacy, and we just have 3 left. This fallacy involves including irrelevant or distracting information to take an argument off track. The name comes from back in the day when people would go fox hunting on horses with their dogs. Supposedly, opposing hunting teams would often lay out a red herring, a fish with a very poignant smell, to distract the other team's hunting dogs and take them off track. Here's an example of the red herring fallacy from the movie Thank You for Smoking. The movie is a dark comedy about the head lobbyist for the tobacco industry, how he promotes cigarettes and responds to arguments against smoking. In this scene, he's on a business trip where he brings his son along, and they take the evening off to go to the amusement park, and his son asks him about his job as a lobbyist. See towards the end how the lobbyist introduces irrelevant and distracting information to win the argument against his son.
So you go to an office, then you go on TV and talk about cigarettes. Then you fly out to LA to talk to some guy who works with movie stars. What is that?
It's my job. I'm a lobbyist.
I know, but did you study to do that?
No, I just kind of figured it out.
Then can't anyone just do that?
No, it requires a moral flexibility that goes beyond most people.
Do I have flexible morals?
Well, let's say you became a lawyer, right? And you were asked to defend a murderer. Worse than that, a child murderer. Now, the law states that every person deserves a fair trial. Would you defend them?
I don't know. I guess every person deserves a fair defense.
Yeah, well, so do multinational corporations.
So, what happens when you're wrong?
Oh, Joey, I'm never wrong.
But you can't always be right.
Well, if it's your job to be right, then you're never wrong.
But what if you are wrong?
Okay, let's say that you're defending chocolate, and I'm defending vanilla. Now, if I were to say to you, vanilla is the best flavor ice cream, you'd say...
No, chocolate is.
Exactly. But you can't win that argument. So, I'll ask you. So you think chocolate is the end-all and be-all of ice cream, do you?
It's the best ice cream. I wouldn't order any of it.
Oh, so it's all chocolate for you, is it?
Yes, chocolate is all I need.
Well, I need more than chocolate. And for that matter, I need more than vanilla. I believe that we need freedom and choice when it comes to our ice cream, and that, Joy Naylor, that is the definition of liberty.
But that's not what we're talking about.
Ah, but that's what I'm talking about.
But You didn't prove that vanilla's the best.
I didn't have to. I proved that you're wrong, and if you're wrong, I'm right.
But you still didn't convince me.
It's that I'm not after you. I'm after them.
Classic example of a red herring fallacy. And by the way, a great movie about persuasion, rhetoric, and communication. Next is the fallacy of guilt by association, which involves arguing against a position simply based on what that position is associated with versus the actual merits of the position. Take a look at this old political ad from the presidential election between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater in the 1960s. Notice how this ad from Johnson's campaign tries to connect Barry Goldwater to the Ku Klux Klan by quoting a leader of the KKK who says he likes Barry Goldwater. And since they're supposedly connected, you should definitely vote for Lyndon Johnson.
We represent the majority of the people in Alabama who hate niggerism, Catholicism, Judaism, and all the isms of the whole world. So said Robert Creel of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan. He also said, I like Barry Goldwater. He needs our help. Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd.
Again, no real substantive argument here, just fallacious reasoning based on guilt by association. Finally, we have the logical fallacy of false comparison. This is a breakdown in the analogical reasoning we mentioned earlier, where the comparison or analogy or metaphor simply doesn't work. It's too outrageous or incorrect or simply inappropriate. Take a look at this image you may have seen during the recent presidential campaign. This image is clearly trying to make an argument about President Obama based on analogical reasoning, making a comparison. But regardless of your political affiliation, I think we can all agree that this comparison is erroneous at best. There is simply no comparison between the policies of the Obama administration and the atrocities of Hitler and the Nazis. There's no valid argument here, just a breakdown in reasoning based on a false comparison. Okay, we made it. That's all the logical fallacies we need to cover. There are numerous other ways that reasoning can break down and lots of other logical fallacies we could cover. But these are some of the main ones you should be aware of. And again, the point is that with logical fallacies, the position or claim of the argument isn't necessarily incorrect, but rather that the reasoning offered to connect the claim and the evidence is mistaken or erroneous. It may in fact be the case that Scott Brown is a bad candidate, or that you should vote for Mike Huckabee or Lyndon Johnson, or that we should send more troops to Iraq, or that religious belief is wrong, or that vanilla ice cream is the best, or that Obama is in fact a bad president, but not for the reasons offered in these previous examples. This is faulty reasoning. The logical appeal is fallacious. The arguments are invalid. But wait a minute. This still raises some questions. After all, fallacious arguments are very effective in a certain sense, meaning that sometimes they still persuade people, even if the reasoning is erroneous. And much of the persuasion we experience, from TV ads to political campaigns to things our friends say to things we believe, is often based on faulty reasoning. So what's going on here? Well, in addition to everything we just learned about logic, reason, and argumentation, we also need to consider an alternative paradigm to account for the prevalence and effectiveness of persuasion that is based on fallacious reasoning and invalid arguments. And this rounds out the final section of our video lecture. We'll look at the alternative paradigm of narrative rationality to help us explain why so much persuasion and decision-making seems to happen outside the bounds of valid logic and reasoning, even as important as these things are. This paradigm of narrative rationality was developed by an American communication scholar named Walter Fisher. Now, Fisher's ideas about narrative rationality are based on two key premises. First, that people are not purely rational. We don't make all our decisions solely on the basis of logical arguments. Despite what some economists and philosophers might tell us about humans being calculated, self-interested, rational actors, much of our behavior is actually a complicated mix of emotions, motivations, conflicting interests, and subjective preferences. We're not robots. We're humans. Second, we're also storytelling creatures. We interpret things based on sequence and meaning. We make decisions based on good reasons, not always pure logic. So Fisher's narrative paradigm says that we usually, if not always, assess arguments based on the characteristics of a good story. In particular, we focus on fidelity and coherence. Fidelity has to do with the credibility and believability of a story. Does it seem truthful? And coherence is about the consistency of a story. Does it hang together and make sense? To the extent that stories, or narratives, have fidelity and coherence, we tend to accept them, regardless of whether or not they have some logical inconsistency or technical shortcoming that some philosopher might point out. To put it another way, think of any story or narrative you accept and identify with, whether it's a narrative about our economic or political situation, a narrative about the value and significance of your college education, or a narrative about humanity and your place in the world. The narrative paradigm, based on the ideas of narrative rationality, says you accept and identify with these stories because to you they have fidelity and coherence. They seem true and make sense based on your experiences. So this is still logical. This is still about logos. It's just a different kind of logic. Rather than the logic of pure rationality, we're talking about the logic of narrative, appealing to people on the logic of good reasons based on fidelity and coherence. And this is why there's so much persuasion out there that is quote-unquote effective in a practical sense, even if the arguments are logically fallacious and have errors in reasoning. They still seem true and make sense to people based on their experiences. Logically, President Obama is not comparable to Hitler and the Nazis. Of course this is faulty reasoning. But to some people this comparison rings true and adheres to their perspective. Of course Scott Brown is a reasonable Senate candidate, even if you disagree with his policies. But to some people there is nothing a Republican politician can do right, and it does make sense to interpret Scott Brown's actions in line with the personal attacks we saw earlier in our example. Now, pointing out logical fallacies often doesn't work if the faulty reasoning still lines up with a broader narrative that people identify with. And the persuaders know this. Advertisers and politicians, for example, don't really care that their arguments might contain faulty reasoning. They care more about aligning their claims with broader narratives that demonstrate fidelity and coherence with people's experiences. Now, one response to all this might be that irrationality is the problem, and we need to do a better job of eliminating irrationality from public discourse and personal decision-making. Perhaps, but that is to deny a fundamental aspect of human existence. Emotions, motives, personal interests, subjective preferences, and diverse experiences are not character flaws. They are what make us human, and in many ways make life worth living. There are many situations where logical, rational appeals are critical to effective persuasion. And for those situations, we have a good framework for understanding how to develop valid arguments and sound reasoning. The Toulmin model and the inductive, deductive, and analogical reasoning we just talked about. And we have ways for recognizing when reasoning breaks down into logical fallacies. But there are other situations where other logics are at play, and narrative rationality provides an alternative paradigm to help us comprehend these situations as well, making us more complete in our understanding of persuasion in society. So let's wrap this up. We covered three main topics in this video lecture. First, we looked at how to develop a good argument, emphasizing the Toulmin model of argumentation, and three main types of reasoning. This provides a blueprint for a good argument, showing the necessary components and how they should fit together, while also acknowledging that only having a good argument is rarely sufficient for effective persuasion. There's still a lot more we need to do in terms of style and aesthetic appeal, but this is the foundation. Second, we looked at breakdowns in reasoning and a variety of logical fallacies that can occur that make arguments invalid. Finally, we discussed an alternative paradigm of narrative rationality to help us understand why supposedly irrational arguments are still pervasive and effective. This relates to how we make sense of our experiences and the broader narratives we identify with. And that concludes this video lecture on logic, reasoning, and argumentation. Thanks for watching.